massive amount of training on the row. Oh, okay. We also do a massive amount of training on the row machine, which is the prime kind of topic of this presentation. And then again, somewhere between kind of 5 to 20% is typically cross training, so base aerobic training in different modalities. So it might be cycling, running, cross country skiing, etc., something like that. So that just gives you like for you guys who are not familiar with the sport, hopefully a little bit of background into kind of what goes on. And in terms of what happens from a physiology testing point of view, so within rowing, we have a beautiful device called the rowing ergometer. It's a very commonly used piece of kit. It's one of those things that's actually quite often used for selection in some programs, particularly for some of the younger athletes that coaches are actually looking for people to hit very specific benchmarks on the rowing machine for selection. And it's always a 2,000 meter ergo that's typically used, because that's the kind of race distance. So irrespective of boat class or gender, that's always seems to be what's used. And the other thing that we might also use is a 5K. That's typically really common as a kind of physiology test, if you like, on the from a rowing program perspective. But obviously, when you use these kind of things in isolation, we can't really understand the mechanisms that underpin it. Obviously, a longer duration like a 5K does give you some kind of insight into maybe that athlete's aerobic capacity, but then that obviously leads to other means being used within the sport if we want to look at physiology in a bit more detail. And typically that's often two main aspects. So that's either a maximum oxygen uptake or VO2 max test, which is a common one, or using kind of lactate step tests as well, and that helps us understand a little bit about of what's going on in terms of from the physiology side. So there's quite a number of studies, particularly in the body of literature around rowing, and in terms of VO2 max, very predictive of 2K performance, things like slow twitch muscle fibers, power outputs at lactate threshold, all these type of things show very strong correlations to 2K performance on the ergometer. And the only kind of issue is quite often we're looking at studies that typically only really quantify aerobic measures. So very few studies and testing kind of methodologies, if you like, within rowing go into detail around what's going on at an anaerobic perspective. And the main thing obviously being, why is that not working? One of the main things being lab testing can be quite expensive. It can be quite access restricted. So if you haven't got the opportunity to get to the lab, and of course labor intensive as well, you know, quite often we'd be in a scenario where if we wanted to do VO2 max testing with athletes and we've got a large group of athletes to get to, it can be logistically quite difficult to organize for a big group of rowers. So one of the things that was done is a kind of more practical, cheaper methodology, which has been used to quantify kind of all the energy systems. So this is what we're going to go on to talk about in terms of a power duration or critical power model. So kind of a little bit around what is critical power and what's power duration and how those things feed in. So power duration ultimately refers to a maximum power output, maximum power output effort given for a fixed period of time. So for any given period of time, what's the highest average power that you can achieve? And if you kind of do multiples of these efforts, we're able to draw that power duration curve. And when we join those points, we assume that there's a kind of a hyperbolic relationship between them. And where once we've kind of drawn that graph, so the line that the curve never quite touches, for those of you that do a lot of maths in the room, that's the asymptote of the curve. That's the kind of flat into dotted line that you can see there on the graph. And then we have what's called the the W prime or the anaerobic tank is the curvature constant. So at any given point, if we draw a point across and down, we get a fixed area underneath the curve. So that's what we call our anaerobic tank or our W prime. And basically, critical power mainly separates what we call the severe domain of intensity versus the heavy domain. So that threshold is quite important. So the severe domain is basically where we can't really stabilize physiology. The effort is beyond a level that we're able to manage for a decent duration. So, for example, it's basically that point of critical power is where most of our energy is deriving from our aerobic metabolism, whereas we start to get into our severe domain, we've kind of reached a point where we can't just use our aerobic system and we're having to rely on our anaerobic system as well. So basically fatigue increases and the recovery cost also increases. And, training volume, you can kind of accumulate above the critical power. So training above that severe domain is quite limited. And, if we're looking at what we can do below, we can do a lot more training below. So in the more moderate and heavy domain below critical power is where we can do the most. And I think that's particularly more prevalent when you consider the kind of exponential cost of intensity when it comes to endurance training. So kind of, we think about a 2-minute maximal zone 5 effort versus 2 hours of steady state below lactate threshold. Although one is a much longer training duration, the other one likely has a more higher physiological cost because of the intensity associated with that. So what's traditionally done with power duration? So what we can have is what you see there is, again, another power duration curve. And each of those kind of time points on the curve represents a different test duration. So I think there's like 90 seconds, 3 minutes, 6.5 minutes, and 12-minute efforts there to kind of visualize the curve. So what used to be done is what we used to call time to exhaustion trials. So what happened was you get given a fixed power output, and you basically tell an athlete, this is all from a research context, but you basically tell an athlete to hold that power for as long as possible, and then you'd be measuring the time of how long they can hold that until they can't. And that was considered the kind of gold standard way in terms of trying to figure out and calculate critical power. But obviously you can imagine as an athlete or coach, that's a pretty grim process to go through. So it's really hard to execute. It's very tough on the athletes, and it made it quite kind of unappealing to coaches and practitioners to want to use that. But in the past few years, more of an interest in the kind of using what we call fixed time trials to establish a power duration relationship has made it a bit more interesting. So by replacing that, we can basically have the athletes perform max efforts, but they're more self-paced. And this, in kind of later studies, had been shown to produce more reliable results. Sorry, just going back one thing. So like I was saying, we've got those 2 points there. So the kind of critical power, so that curve asymptote, so that red dotted line on this one. And then we've got that anaerobic tank as well, which represents that area underneath the curve. So if we're going to calculate that, it's really simple. There are quite a few ways to calculate critical power. I'm going to go through with you the kind of most simple way, but it does determine how exactly we get those values for critical power can vary depending on the method you use. But the most simple way is to plot a work versus time, or a linear work versus time curve graph. So work done we can calculate as the power output for that time. So that gives us a value in joules. And what's plotted here is kilojoules. which is just joules to the 1,000. So very, very simple. Those same points are plotted, and then we draw a straight line between that curve. And the equation of that graph, so the gradient of that line, so how steep that linear line is, gives us our critical power. And the W prime is where the line intercepts at the y-axis. So you can see there y equals 282x plus 36,008. So that is the 282 being the critical power, and then the y-intercept, the 36,008, representing our anaerobic tank or our W prime. So there is traditionally that was talked about doing a multitude of tests. So a lot of people who were trying to profile this in research were using kind of 4 or 5 tests. That had been streamlined down to 3, but Mehdi, who has actually helped us develop a lot of this within rowing, he's a cycling coach out in Holland, but is also an ex-rower himself. He put together a really good study on his cycling guys, and actually determined that you can get a really good estimate for critical power and W prime from just 2 tests. So rather than using 3 tests, which makes things a little bit more methodology wise a little bit easier. So the only problem with that is, if we go back a slide, if we're using only 2 single points on the graph, we will always get a R² value for the graph equal to 1. So the kind of relationship as to how those points fit up linearly will always be 1. So it's a bit more difficult to then know if there is a underperformance or overperformance on one of the tests that might be affecting your results. So that's the downside. But the good thing that Mehdi talked about is that endurance athletes are so consistent, particularly cyclists in this case, that they are able to deliver very reliable time trial results, and therefore you get a really good estimate for critical power in W prime. And this was mainly due, when Mehdi looked at this paper, there was kind of no difference in the estimated CP and W prime values between the groups, but that's only because of the training status of those athletes. So we adopted this methodology. So we adopted this idea of using 2 trials and using a 3 and a 12-minute time trial to help us map our power duration curves. And so I think the best way to explain how these things maybe fit in terms of the real life is to think of the critical power as like the engine, and the W prime is like the battery. So critical power is obviously measured in watts. It's kind of the greatest metabolic rate that's what we kind of say is wholly oxidative. So there shouldn't be so much, there's not really a progressive buildup of lactate, and that's kind of matched by your body's ability to be able to break it down. Typically, the argument is that it can be maintained for somewhere around 30 to 60 minutes until glycogen depletes, but it depends a little bit on how you estimate critical power and the type of method that's used. I think cycling likely hold. If you're estimating critical power in the same methodology in cycling, it's likely that they can probably hold it slightly longer than what the rowers can, but I'm not going to go into too much detail with that. But and then W prime is like the kind of battery. So the best way to kind of conceptually think about this is a bit like the reverse of a hybrid car, if you like, where you're mainly using your engine, and then when you're going really, really far, you tap into your battery as well. So that basically defines kind of how much energy is left in the tank when you're above power output. So that is relative to the duration that you're doing. So if you're only slightly above critical power, then the duration of your battery to last is actually slightly longer. Whereas if you're very far above critical power, then that battery is going to deplete much quicker. I think another way to kind of conceptualize it is a little bit like W prime's kind of like your buffer to resist energy, exercise during intensities above. So it's like one way we talked about this is kind of like a money bag above that. But I saw quite a good, saw quite a good analogy online, which was this kind of financial analogy, and it kind of mentioned about, so you can think of critical power as your regular income, and W prime is a bit like your savings. So you can spend your regular income almost indefinitely and never run out of money, but if you spend money faster than you earn it, you use up your savings. And you could spend your savings only for a kind of, you could spend your savings slowly only for a longer period of time, or quickly for a short period. But once your savings are gone, then it's going to take much more income again to come back in to build your savings. So I thought it was quite a nice way to conceptualize it. But so in the real world, so this is just an example scenario, you might have two athletes with the same 2K time, and one athlete might achieve that with a big engine and a smaller battery, and the other one might achieve that with a smaller engine but a much bigger battery. So hypothetically, if we're talking about a race scenario, in this case, athlete one is probably going to be more likely to be able to hold the pace through the middle of the race. So they're going to be more dominant through that middle race pace, whereas athlete two is going to be the one that perhaps has probably a larger start, but certainly a larger sprint finish towards the end of the race. Sorry. And just kind of one thing on that is that I think we need both qualities in the sport of rowing. I think with the way that the sport's gone physically, technically, and the kind of evolution of it over the time, there's not necessarily just one big way. I think certainly from my experience, I've seen all these type of athletes be successful. So, ones that are aerobically very strong, and ones that are also anaerobically very strong, but have still managed to get themselves onto the podium at Olympic Games. I think that idea is really critical. It's not about whether one is more optimal than the other, but you have to understand those concepts to help you maybe build the crews and help understand how you might develop certain qualities in that athlete. And then this is kind of typically what are, in an applied setting, what a typical test protocol looks like for us. So we'll do always some weigh-in and some skin folds and throw. They'd always have a warm-up, and then we like to get a full curve to also plot some max power efforts as well on the ergometer to give us the kind of sprint power side of things. So we'd always do kind of 2 lots of max power strokes. So typically like some 3 strokes on the rowing machine to get to rhythm, and then 5 strokes max, and then being able to plot all 5 of those strokes actually to understand how that athlete applies kind of their maximal sprint power. Then a bit of rest, and then they do their 3-minute maximum effort. So I guess for those of you that are rowing coaches, we typically, if they've never done a 3-minute effort before, and I'll emphasize familiarization is important with this type of protocol, but if they've never done a 3-minute effort before, we kind of say to the guys to roughly go off somewhere between 2 to 2.5 splits quicker than their 2K pace. So for example, if my 2K pace is, say my 2K time's 6 minutes and my pace is therefore 1:30, then I want to go off somewhere between 1:27.5 to 1:28. And the idea is on that 3-minute effort is we want to fully deplete that anaerobic store. So what we don't want is that the athlete's actually able to sprint and ramp up power at the end of the test. We want them to go hard enough that they've got almost nothing left in the tank and that they're hanging on for dear life at the back end of the test, because that way we know we fully depleted that anaerobic store. Obviously then typically after a 3-minute effort like that, then they'd have a recovery paddle, and then we have tried doing the tests on the same day, but we've just found in terms of getting results and managing fatigue, it was better to do the testing over 2 days. But day 2, then, similar thing, we'd have our warm up and then the 12-minute effort. So the 12-minute fixed time trial. Again, if we had someone that had never done it before, so they didn't really know what their kind of target was, we'd ask them to go about a split to a 1.5 quicker than their best 5K. Again, so if they were doing a 1:40, 1:40 per 500 for 5K, then we'll ask them to go 1:38.5, 1:39 And it's not like, the 12-minute is not like the 3-minute where you want that power to be dropping off at the end. It's much more flat paced kind of effort, a bit like you'd expect kind of from the 5K really. It's just a much more of a hard aerobic effort, and then of course some kind of recovery or paddle in the afternoon. So we kind of looked at from some of our data how good some of those variables are. So once you've gone through that testing and you've calculated your critical power and your W prime, I think this data is actually slightly older, but we'll go with it anyway. But we actually show really good relationships to performance. So we kind of recognize actually they are quite important variables, and even as standalone variables, they're quite predictive of future 2K performance, which is really good. And from that, we kind of developed a bit of a kind of a so-called KPI model, if you like, where we can kind of understand the importance of those things. So I think one thing to be said, of course, we're looking just at the physical side on the rowing machine here. We're not even touching the technical, psychological side of things at all. If we're just looking at a 2K ergometer performance, and we understand that those kind of variables are key. So our critical power and our anaerobic tank there, and our sprint power as well, is also really important. When we combine those three variables and we do like a multi-regression analysis, it can actually be really predictive of performance. So it's understanding kind of from our side, right, what are those key aspects made out of? Obviously, if I want to change sprint power, it's like, I'm going to be spending more time in the gym. And if I want to change my critical power, I want to be spending time doing endurance training, etc. So this was just to help us kind of conceptually understand the importance of those variables and where they maybe fit in onto the bigger picture. And kind of what we found, so if you take those three kind of regression values and predictors, if we developed kind of like a multivariate regression equation, and that helped us kind of estimate some of our 2K performances. So if we looked at what we were predicting versus what the athlete was doing, actually a lot of the time we were within less than 1% on average. So providing we did the testing right, i.e. testing times that, we were controlling them well, we were not overcooking them before they come into testing, etc. We can be really quite predictive of what they then do from a 2K performance. And, I think sometimes it's like, well, this is unsurprising because we're looking at two max time trials. One is below their 2K, and the other is above their 2K. But it's kind of testament, I think, to their ability to really replicate maximal efforts. And I think I always question whether that's due to the kind of cadence of the sport of rowing is a little bit lower than maybe like cycling or running, for example. So the kind of the movement cycles per minute is a little bit lower. So I wonder if that helps them be a little bit more efficient. But I think that's one thing when you're working with high level endurance athletes, that they are able to do very, very well if you plan your training right, etc. So it's certainly useful for us, because not only can we then decide, well, if I've got an athlete who I know has pulled a 6-minute 2K very close to what their testing is, and the predicting 2K is coming out at 6:10, then I know that's actually quite far away. Either their test results are poor and they maybe didn't execute as well as the test, or something's not right there. And I can then start to use that as a bit of a sense check as to whether I've also then got accurate values of critical power and W prime. Hopefully that makes sense. And so for us, from kind of like a practical aspect, this is what we kind of give to the athletes and coaches as an output. So of course, we've got our kind of raw data at the top there. So just comparing maybe what they did now to last time versus previous occasions, and for just a raw data, being able to eyeball kind of what changed, what tests went up versus what went down. And then the kind of main information that we need, so the physiology side of things. So obviously, our peak power, what we can do rawly on that sprint power or max strokes test, that's going to represent our kind of fatigue-free neuromuscular power, and that's That's going to be highly influential from a race perspective, particularly at the start, but probably also slightly at the finish as well. And of course, in terms of, if you've got an athlete with a stronger limit, then for them to row what they need to do is going to be more efficient. So for example, if I race at 400 watts, but my maximal production is 800 watts, if I increase that to 1,000, then to race at 400 watts becomes a little bit more efficient, and I've got more room then to maneuver how much power I can produce. Of course, then for us, if we're looking at changes in peak power, we're looking somewhere between like a 2.5% to 5% is usually like a meaningful change for us. Again, we've got the kind of critical power, or put it down as aerobic power there, just conceptually for the athletes to understand. But typically, we'd be looking at somewhere around 5 watts as a meaningful change for us. And again, with the W prime, we're probably looking somewhere around 2 kilojoules as a meaningful change for us. Just to give you some idea as to how we look test battery to test battery. And I think, in basic terms, like high quality quantity of endurance training is going to be the thing that changes that critical power, and generally increases in strength and power are going to lead to changes in our peak power and our W prime. Of course, W prime, it can also be influenced by some of those kind of anaerobic glycolytic influence as well. But I'm a big believer that muscle mass and strength is really influential from what I've seen of our guys on W prime. And then again, one of the most important things is giving our athletes some training zones to work off as well. So, we've got what we call our kind of zone 1, or in German, they use like the general aerobic 0 is the zone. So that's like kind of our active recovery. So we kind of only use that between either between pieces, or if we want the guys to do a recovery style session. But to be honest, typically if we were asking the guys to do a zone 1 more recovery style session, we'd probably change the modality. That would normally be like on the bike or something like that. We've then got our kind of GA1 zone, or what we might describe as zone 2, and we've got that split into like a mid and an upper zone. So the mid zone is kind of the bare minimum where I would expect the guys for endurance adaptations to occur. And then the upper zone is going to be more of where we do most of our steady state kind of ergometers. So your 3 times 30 minutes, your 16k ergos, your 3 times 5ks, whatever you're doing for most of your meat of your training, if you like, is where you're going to spend most of the time in that zone 2 upper. And then we've got like our threshold type zones. So those are those typical kind of 2 to 4 millimole type zones, or like sweet spot type training. So that tends to be, certainly for us as rowers, that's always like rate capped. It tends to be more like distance per stroke type work, but it's above what you describe as kind of steady state training. And then we've got like our zone 4 type intervals, so our kind of longer aerobic intervals, and then the zone 5 intervals are kind of near max intense efforts. So they're kind of intense, non-sustainable, but not necessarily maximal, but much more about finding kind of where that limit is and working just below that limit to try and optimize as much as we can within that zone. So for us, obviously, we get a couple of things. We get a quantification of both our aerobic and some information about our anaerobic system as well. Obviously, we use those to provide our training zones, which is really important for us because we're going to be doing quite a lot of training on the ergometer, and that's really key for us that we've got accurate training zones for the guys, because that's where we have the most control. You're not affected by the conditions, the temperature, etc., etc. And we get a much more kind of broader view of physiology. So there's no kind of, there's no single factor that makes a 2K performance, i.e. just focusing on power at 2 millimole or just focusing on VO2 max. It's a much more global approach, in my opinion. And for me, probably the single most important thing is it gives us some information and capacity to individualize our training. So typically we try and use some of this information to group our guys, which I'm going to go on to. And typically we'd look at somewhere between 1 to 2 individual sessions per week, depending on, you know, what their development areas are versus what their strengths. Might be some other stuff. It might be more of an injury management perspective. So, you know, for someone who's maybe low on peak power, it might be some extra work in the gym or something like that. Or someone who's maybe low on aerobic power, it might be top up aerobic steady state work on the bike or something, whatever it might be. This gives us some information to go off to think about how we individualize our training. And I think, you know, of course, with every testing, there's limitations. So you can't cover everything with a single battery of tests. I think for me, every effort being maximal means if an athlete is underperforming or doesn't put a big effort in, then it's not going to be reflective of their physiology. So, you know, they're not going to get good, accurate values of their critical power W prime, which, you know, does happen sometimes. I mean, for us, like I've said, the 2K predictor then becomes a really good reflection as to how representative the test is. But, you know, there's always going to be those limitations with testing data. And, you know, we talk about kind of 3 energy systems, if you like, the sprint, anaerobic, aerobic system, but the deep-seatedness of physiology is much more complex than that. I think probably a lot more going on that doesn't, you know, it's not really covered, but ultimately we're trying to keep it as simple as possible for coaches, the coaches and the athletes. And of course, then, you know, fatigue and effort is going to affect your results. You know, if you're coming into your testing battery and you're really overcooked, then it's going to make it really difficult. And sometimes if you hugely overperform on a test, so if you overperformed on the 3-minute but massively underperformed on the 12-minute, then you might still get a fairly accurate 2K prediction, but you might get a very underrepresented critical power, but a very overinflated W prime. So it makes it sometimes quite difficult to do that. And, you know, we're looking at mathematical modeling of just external measures. We're not looking at any internal measures. So we're not looking at actually what's going on within inside the body, which is, you know, of course, a very important aspect as to how you're then going to give the guys the right training and certainly gathering information in terms of what areas need to be developed. So obviously the default is to take some of those values there and use it to kind of benchmark and compare some of our athletes. So that's just some of the data from our heavyweight men. So on top of the peak power, of course, comes directly from the test, the anaerobic tank, the aerobic power or the critical power, whatever you want to call it. We also look at an anaerobic power reserve. So that's basically just the peak power minus the aerobic power. And then a kind of critical power peak power ratio. So how much as a percentage of your critical power are you utilizing of what your kind of maximal capacity is as a bit of a marker of efficiency. And then of course the athlete's own kind of 2K as well. But the reason we look at some of those additional ones is one of the things you have to understand about the W prime or the anaerobic tank is that it's what you describe as a relative value. So critical power, peak power are absolute values. You know, as performance improves, also those values improve. Whereas because the anaerobic tank is relative, you can have a very high anaerobic tank, but this doesn't necessarily mean from a performance perspective, that you are doing very well. It might just represent, because your anaerobic tank is relative and has a symbiotic relationship to that critical power, it might actually mean that just your aerobic power is really, really poor. So sometimes you have to be really careful around like, oh, yeah, that athlete's 40 kilojoules anaerobic tank, but actually it might mean that they're just aerobically poorly trained. So sometimes you have to bear some of those values in mind. And the other thing there, so you can see the red is the kind of, I can't remember which testing battery this is actually. I can't remember the time span, apologies, but you can see red there is the predicted value versus what that athlete has actually done on the 2K test. So you can see there's actually some really tight values there. You know, if you're predicting your 2K within a percent, then you're certainly close to what that athlete's actually capable of. But you know, equally, you can see some guys are a couple of seconds away. It's never going to be perfect for everyone, but certainly gives some. Hopefully, it gives for you, certainly you rowing coaches who are out there in the room, some context as to how tight you can actually get the measurements. And then, you know, for those of you that have done a lot in sports science, we also sometimes use a Z-score. So on top of benchmarking those athletes, we also use a Z-score just to give an idea of kind of how well the individual compares to the group. So it's quite a good kind of communicating tool with the athletes. So if your Z-score is basically, if you've got the mean value for the group is how many standard deviations you are above or below the mean. So if you're one standard deviation above the mean, then you're in the upper kind of 15% of the group. And if you're one standard deviation below, then you're in the bottom kind of 15% of the group. That kind of just gives the athletes the context as to how they're performing relative to each other, and also gives the coach that information as well. They're the same kind of data there from the men's team, but just, you know, visually helps us understand who's strong, who's weak, kind of relative to each other, which is really, really useful, because sometimes it's easy to look at those benchmarks and be like, oh yeah, that person's fine, but actually maybe, you know, in some positions, maybe they're not doing so well. And it maybe, yeah, also for, you know, from my side, it helps us understand, okay, they might have 2 or 3 areas that they need to really work on and develop, but actually which is the one is maybe the most pressing in terms of priority. So, you know, in terms of from an implications point of view, I reiterate that, but I think it's quite important. I appreciate it's really crude, and you know, we're making kind of vast assumptions regarding the physiology. However, a large goal for me is really being around simplifying the training process for our guys as much as possible, making it really easy to communicate with the athletes and coaches, and making it really clear from a physiology development pathway which route that athlete can go down. So keeping it in those terms, in terms of keeping it in those contexts, in terms of saying, right, well, high quality quantity is going to help with critical power and strength. Our glycolytic, lactate tolerance, production type work are going to lead to changes in sprint power, W prime, anaerobic tank. So just keeping that messaging as simply as possible has been really important. So this is just an example of how it might look from us from a training intervention perspective. So I'm going to leave you something to think about, but one of the things we've kind of tossed our head around a lot is this concept of performance limitations versus performance strengths for those athletes. You know, it's very common, I think, particularly within the sports science world, we focus heavily on, say, weaknesses. I'm going to use the term weaknesses, but you know what I mean, or limitations. We focus a lot on that side, but we don't always consider what the strengths of the athlete are and what actually makes them good at what they do. You know, there's a reason that some of our big mutanty strong guys have got massive anaerobic tanks. That's because they've probably got a natural predisposition to that, but that's also really strong at that aspect too. So it's something to always think about, is how we prioritize strengths and weaknesses. And this is kind of what we've thought about. So I was talking to you before about having those kind of 1 to 2 individual sessions. So like how we've kind of planned it is, if we looked at the season split into 3 aspects, so kind of an off season, pre-season, in season, you know, we'd look at 2 individual sessions focusing on those limitations or weaknesses, and then we'd actually then, as we get to the pre-season side, we'd start blending in to focus on some strengths too. So we'd maybe do a block, a training block where I've got an athlete who's poor aerobically, where they're focusing more on aerobic based training, and then they're switching to have their individual work topped up as maybe their strength is their peak power. So maybe they've got some extra gym work to help them. I always question whether this helps psychologically more than anything else, but I think there's probably some physiological aspect from a periodization planning point of view that makes it relevant. And then, once we get towards the in-season time, actually, we don't have as much time for any individual training, particularly on the land. So then we're focusing, maybe it's one kind of high intensity individual session, just focusing on the strength of the athlete to give them as much kind of confidence as possible going into the race season. So for us, this is like really typical of what our week would look like. So from an off season, if we were looking at 2 individual sessions, we obviously do a lot less rowing in the off season, mainly because of the weather really. For us, the guys always go rowing in the morning because the conditions are more suitable for us with where we train on our lake. It tends to be the flattest conditions are early on in the morning. So that tends to be where we lean towards. And then you can see all the other stuff. So like the ergometer training, how some of the weights and the gym sessions fit in, the alternatives, and how we might use the individual sessions, either side of those, to fit that into the week. So again, as an example, so if I've got an athlete who's strong aerobically, so needs to develop their W prime peak power output, it might be 2 additional weights that might have a specific emphasis. So it might be building muscle mass, it might be max strength power work, depending on what their kind of strength diagnostic data might look like. And that'd be 2 weights on top of maybe the 3 they're already doing in the week. Or it might be 1 weight plus, maybe it could be like a short zone 5 session, so like an 8 times 60 seconds or something like that. Again, if it's someone who's maybe stronger anaerobically, but maybe slightly weaker on the aerobic front, we might think about 2 kind of steady state alternative sessions. Or it might be 1 harder kind of zone 4 aerobic endurance session plus maybe a top up alternative. It really can be a multitude of things. It depends kind of, maybe running doesn't work well for that athlete. Maybe we prefer to do it on the bike. Maybe, that athlete is strong on the bike, but maybe struggles on something like the ski erg, where we want to develop some trunk loading, some upper body loading too. So maybe we then switch that alternative session to something like a ski erg. So it really depends. We try and be as individual, as creative as possible, really. But I mean, equally, if we're using those 2 individual slots, it could be none of those things. It could be just working on some health, robustness type aspects. It might be, an athlete who's got recurrent back issues. So maybe we want to top up their work with additional trunk sessions. So it really kind of varies, to be honest. And I think, just a bit in terms of how we've tried to communicate it from a training philosophy point of view, and the message from kind of us as a coaching team, really. And it's really about, we talk about kind of do the steady training steady and the hard training hard. And when I kind of came into Switzerland, there's quite a big culture of athletes thinking that pushing themselves beyond the zone adds additional benefit. It's so important to keep reinforcing the message, to keep the steady training easy. And another way I spoke to the guys about it is this kind of like credit card analogy. So, on a given week, you've got £100 to spend on your credit card. If you're spending £30 on a 60-minute steady state session, then you've got £70 for the other 12 training sessions that you've got to do for the rest of the week. So trying to get them to balance spending their time wisely, and certainly then trying to invest a little bit more energy into the hot or hard sessions. And I think they call it the 80-20 rule, 20-80 rule. I think it originally came from business. I think the exercise physiology world stole this, but it's the kind of principle that 80% of the training effort at steady state is for 20% of the adaptation. And then the flip side is true, that the 20% of training, of the hot training, is for 80% of adaptation. Now, arguably, I really don't think that is strictly true. And obviously, when you see looking at point 3, you can kind of understand why. But it's just trying to get the athletes to kind of recognize when those hot sessions are, and recognize that they are important, that it's not just a tick box session for them, and balancing that through the week is the ultimate message. And there are no shortcuts to building an engine, certainly from the critical power side. Like, it's the quality quantity based training that leads to the biggest changes in aerobic physiology, and there's no shortcut for that, hence the conflict with point 2. But besides my point, it's a training process that takes seasons and years, and even I'd say 2 Olympic cycles at the elite level to truly develop. And when we look at some of the studies that kind of help underpin that for us, this is a really old study from kind of Parolin et al. 99, but one of the things that we also talked about when we're doing some of the higher intensity training is how we use some of the rest periods. So this is a study that looked at kind of 30-second max efforts with, I think it was 3 or 4 minute rest periods in between. And I think they did 3 or 4 reps, but if you look at the first rep, which is point A versus point B, actually there's a really big difference in energy contributions for those reps. And I think one of the things that's done in rowing a lot is that people think 3 minutes rest is a really long time. So trying to get athletes, when we're doing some of those hotter zone 5 sessions, to actually be like, no, you need 12, 15-minute rest if we want to really optimize, let's say, point A, where we're trying to really work on the anaerobic side and working on the glycolytic system, is really critical. And getting people's heads around that is really important. And that's kind of it's further backed up by the idea. So this is again another one from, I think it's Ferguson 2010. But each of those time points along the graph represents a 2-minute, 6-minute, and 15-minute recovery between intervals. So obviously, if you're working on VO2 max, then if you're working at VO2 max specific intervals, then yes, you can get away with 2, 3, 4-minute rest intervals. But if you're trying to develop someone's W prime, actually we need huge rest periods to be able to do that. So trying to get that across to athletes, it's been really, really important. And how we actually trialed that, this is a conference poster that I did in Switzerland, and this kind of looked at the effectiveness of it for our group. But we looked at, this was actually over the kind of COVID period as well, that we looked at kind of 10 weeks of normal training plus 1 HIIT training. Just some of the background in terms of that's what they were still doing per week, so 16 hours plus minus 6. We did a pre-post 2K measure, so 2K week 0 and another 2K on week 11, and we kind of had 2 styles of session, so splitting the guys into a strong aerobic group and that strong anaerobic group like you've seen on the kind of previous slides. This was just a run through of some of the sessions that we used kind of across the week. So obviously the guys that were kind of stronger anaerobically had much longer work intervals for the kind of high intensity session, and the guys who were kind of stronger aerobically had much shorter work intervals, because we're trying to challenge the bias for that kind of glycolytic system, if you like. And for us, so for me, it's probably some of the best changes I've seen from a single 2 time points of 2K performance. So each point represents the kind of smallest worthwhile change plus the typical error, either side of those little bars. So if you're kind of past the smallest worthwhile change area and your typical area either side, is you can be pretty certain that that person's made a massive change in performance. And I think for me, that's probably the best set of test results I've seen within an elite rowing population. Just, for me, probably highlighting the idea that if you are chasing after something that you feel might be a limiting factor, you can get really, really good performance gains. But, I'm also talking about data here where we were over on this poster, where we were over the kind of COVID, lockdown period where a lot of things changed. And I think certainly for our athletes probably felt a little bit of stress relief and a little bit of pressure was off them. And we had some guys come back that were in exceptional shape. And after we kind of trialed this kind of intervention, some guys that came back in not so great shape. So we had kind of a full variety. So it can be hard to interpret sometimes, but I hope that gives you guys just some insight into using this type of model, really, and just giving you some background in terms of how we've used it from a training perspective and what the data is we've got out of it. But I think that's me, guys. So just want to say thanks a lot for, if you're still on the line 52 minutes later, well done to you. But yeah.
Thank you very much, James. I'm just going to stop the recording now, just in case you have any questions.
Worries.